You're listening to The End of the Road in Michigan, the podcast that uncovers the forgotten, the unusual, and the fascinating stories that shaped our state. Romeo, Michigan sits about 35 miles north of Detroit, and for a few decades in the early 1900s, it lived on a clock set by electric rail. Then, almost overnight in historical terms, that clock went silent. In the years around 1900, Romeo was already an established village with deep roots and a compact downtown. Its streets were laid out for foot traffic, short errands, and neighbors who expected to see each other. The town did not rise from heavy industry. It rose from trade, services, and agriculture, with orchards and farms shaping the cash flow and the calendar. Romeo's location helped. It sat in a region crisscrossed by transportation corridors, older roads, later rail, then electric interurban lines that stitched southeast Michigan together. If you lived in Romeo at the start of the 20th century, you could live a rural life and still reach larger towns with relative ease. Romeo's downtown functioned as a service center for the surrounding countryside. People came into town to buy hardware, visit the bank, handle legal needs, ship goods, and catch up on local talk. That pattern was older than automobiles. It was part of how small Michigan towns stayed strong, a tight business core surrounded by productive land. By the late 1800s, railroads strengthened that role. Local histories note the arrival of the Michigan Airline Railroad in 1870 and the Grand Trunk's move into Romeo in 1879, giving the village more reliable links for freight and travel. But the biggest day-to-day change for ordinary residents came with the introduction of electric interurban service. Interurbans were electric railways designed to connect towns beyond city limits. Think of them as the missing link between streetcar networks and longer-distance rail. They carried commuters, shoppers, students, and weekend visitors. They also changed how people used time. One major operator in southeast Michigan was the Detroit United Railway, created through consolidation and expansion in the early 1900s. Local Romeo histories commonly cite a service window of roughly 1898 to 1934 for the DUR connection in the village. That's a long run in human terms, long enough for a child to grow up with it and raise their own family before it was gone. Here's the counterintuitive insight. In the early 1900s, a resident of Romeo could be more practically connected by public transportation than a resident several decades later. When interurbans disappeared, the modern replacement was not a better public option. It was a dependence on private cars and roads. The interurban changed daily life in plain, specific ways. It made shopping trips more frequent. Instead of planning a full-day wagon trip, residents could travel on a schedule and return the same day. It made work travel possible without having to move away. People could live in or near Romeo and reach jobs or businesses in other towns with less friction than earlier generations faced. It also changed who came to Romeo. Interurbans brought outsiders, day trippers, visitors, and people curious about a village they'd heard about from friends or family. Even if those visitors didn't spend a fortune, they spent something. They bought meals, snacks, small goods, and services. They brought in traffic that helped merchants justify higher inventory levels and longer hours. Romeo's economy was tied to agriculture, particularly the orchard belt that gave the area a strong seasonal identity. When you build a local economy around crops, the problem is always the same. How do you bring buyers to you or get your product to buyers before it loses value? Transportation solves that problem. Railroads carried freight, and interurbans moved people. Together, they expanded Romeo's practical market. Orchard culture grew into a public identity in the early 1930s. The Romeo Peach Festival traces its start to 1931, driven by growers and merchants who wanted to promote the harvest and boost local business. It's easy to treat a festival as pure entertainment, but in a farm region, a festival is also commerce. It is an advertisement you can taste. It tells people from outside the area, come here, spend here, remember us. And the timing matters. The festival begins during the Great Depression. That suggests a community that uses celebration as a strategy, not as an escape. Romeo's historic district is known for its concentration of preserved buildings and architectural variety, which led the community to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. But set the latter recognition aside. What counts for the early 1900s is what these buildings signaled at the time. A solid bank building signaled local credit and local trust. It meant money was handled close to home. A strong school building signaled that families expected a future here, not somewhere else. Hotels and commercial blocks signaled that Romeo hosted visitors and conducted business beyond the immediate neighborhood. All of that reinforced the town's role as a center for the surrounding area. Romeo also benefited from a recreation culture that grew as the Detroit region expanded. A notable nearby example is the Cascades Development Area in Ray Township. Local history accounts describe the Cascades as a planned summer community concept located along Romeo Plank Road, shaped by land ownership history dating back to early federal land grants. Even when projects like these didn't unfold exactly as boosters promised, the impulse is revealing. Southeast Michigan was creating its weekend places, and areas near Romeo were part of that conversation. That meant more visitors, more local pride, and more reasons for businesses in the Romeo area to exist beyond farm supply and daily essentials. By the 1920s and early 1930s, interurban systems across the Midwest were shrinking. Cars improved, roads improved, buses competed. Private travel took over, and the economics of maintaining electric rail lines weakened. According to local sources, the end of DUR service occurred in the mid-1930s. When that happened, it wasn't just a transportation change. It changed habits. Without the interurban, the town's connections didn't vanish. The roads and rail freight still existed. But everyday mobility became more individual, more dependent on car ownership, and less reliable for people who could not afford that shift. The interurban era trained communities to think in schedules and shared routes. The car era trained communities to think in terms of personal freedom, even as it quietly raised the cost of participation. Romeo in the early 1900s was a village that stayed small without being cut off, because for a while, electric rail made small-town life faster, wider, and more connected than we usually imagine. Then the lines went away, and the town adapted, as it always had. It leaned into what it could control, its downtown, its institutions, and a public identity tied to orchards and community gatherings. If you want to understand Romeo, don't picture it as a place asleep on the edge of Metro Detroit. Picture it as a place that learned early how to welcome outsiders, move goods, and keep local routines intact while the world changed around it. Thank you for listening to this episode of The End of the Road in Michigan. To find out more about this small town, look for this story and sources on thumbwind.com. If you enjoyed today's story, consider subscribing and leaving a review. It helps others find the show. You can read more about this episode, see photos and sources, and explore additional Michigan history at thumbwind.com.